And now, please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, when you look around society today, when you look around at what's going on in the world, our good American culture, what are the things that you would say define it? I know for certain of my friends, as I mentioned in my sort of preview clip for the sermon, would mention Taylor Swift. If they were to define our culture today, their first instinct would be T Swift. Now, I don't happen to be a Swiftie myself, and sometimes I get down, and so if I were to look at society today and what defines our culture, I might say the culture wars seem to define what's going on. It seems like nothing can happen in society without some group or another putting it into a culture war context. We saw this most recently with the change in the Cracker Barrel logo, which cracked me up, that people could have that big a deal of a change of one logo. There's also a divided vision in our country. You know, we have different visions of what our country should be like. What are the elements that make it up at its core? And I don't need to go into all these details. You certainly know them, but you see them at tension constantly. Another theme that people might bring up is a concern for our children. That there's all this evidence that shows that our kids are not all right. Increasing levels of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, all sorts of things that are afflicting our youth and young people today. But one thing that comes to my mind when I think of what might define our culture is that if there's one thing that defines our culture today, we have a culture, I would say, of boasting. It's a culture of boasting, of bragging, of putting it out there. Of course, this was not always the case. I mean, you go back 50, 60 years, and if there's anything that would annoy people, it's seeing someone who was too much of a braggart on TV or in public life. I think of that great quotation from Theodore Roosevelt, "Walk softly, but carry a big stick." Emphasis on the walking softly bit, the humility part. Of course, there's always some tension here with humility. It might be a value we lift up, but some of us might say, well, I still want some of the good things. There's a funny poem I ran across called Dilemma, where the poet says, I want to be famous so I can be humble about being famous. What good is my humility when I am stuck in this obscurity? But when we think about the rise of this boastful culture in our society, most people would go back to the great boxer Muhammad Ali. I mean, you see those clips from the 1960s, and there's Muhammad Ali yelling out on the TV screen, "I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest." And I know that at the time, there were many people that felt that this was something that someone should not say. That this was going above and beyond. This is not what athletes are supposed to do. Not supposed to brag about this and boast about this. But when you look at what's happened since then, it seems like the Muhammad Ali approach has become more predominant than a more humble approach. I mean, no matter where you look in our society, we see that sort of boastful sense. And when I moved down to Houston, Texas, I have to say, Houston is one of these cities that prides itself in being boastful. Boastful about just about everything. About the clothes they wear, the houses they're in, whatever it is, they want to boast about it. I mean, one of the phenomena in Houston I ran into that I'd never run into before was this thing of like a $50,000 millionaire, which I'd never heard of. Someone who makes $50,000 but lives like they're a millionaire. So the people who are buying all these things and boasting about, trying to sort of put forth a certain image, even though it doesn't reflect a deeper reality. Then you have our whole influencer culture. I mean, even the concept of having a profession as an influencer, I find kind of mind-blowing. But here are people that quite literally are boasting about everything in their life, whether it be their beauty or their clothes or their travel habits or their cooking skills, combined with sort of, people cooking with like just an apron to show off their bodies, things like that. And then, of course, no discussion of the boastful culture of the United States would be complete without mentioning our president. And regardless of what you feel about the president, or how you vote. Certainly you could say our president defines a culture of boasting. I mean, he is someone who says, I alone can fix it. He is someone who, when I look at his golf scores, I'm like, there's no way he shot a 69, at Bedminster Country Club. Or you see his cabinet meetings where every cabinet person has to go around and tell him how great he is around the room. Or European leaders need to call him daddy. You have this incredible culture of boastfulness. But of course, Donald Trump is not the originator of this. I mean, he's a symptom of this larger culture that's going on. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves as we reflect on these changes over time is why? Why has this culture changed so much? Why is boasting now such a big thing? Puffing yourself up. Well, for starters, you have this whole culture of fake it till you make it. That if you project confidence, that other stuff will follow along with it. Right? If you say, oh, how great things are going, you boast about how great things are going even. It can sometimes be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, think of anyone who's trying to start a business. If you're trying to start a business, you're not going to stand up and say, oh, well, it's 50-50 chance of this working out. You're going to be, this is the best business ever. You've got to invest in this. This is fantastic. Let's say you're trying to seal a deal, close a deal in your business dealings. You're going to say, this is the deal that is going to make the difference. This is it. You know this is it. You want to be that self-promoter, that someone who's constantly talking about it. One of my colleagues in the ministry, Mike Piazza, he always cracks me up because no matter what church he's in, it's the best church, it's the biggest church, it's growing at the biggest rate. And I go and I look at the details, I look at their YouTube, I'm like, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. But Mike has done a great job of building up churches, in part because of this incredible confidence that he projects. But he also adds in a little extra boasting for good measure. So you can see why people do this. Another shift as to why this might be the case is that, frankly, it projects confidence and charisma, and people like that. You want to see a winner. You want to see someone who puts himself out there. Even if they lose, there's something about that that's like, oh, okay. To Donald Trump's credit, here's a guy who's been through a number of bankruptcies. His confidence has never waned. But that's one of the things that's helped him continue to be a success in various levels. Because of that, just forever boasting. People can be drawn to it. Be drawn to that sense of confidence. As I mentioned before, I mean, the one thing that drives this boasting culture is our social media. I mean, you look on social media, I always feel bad about posting on social media. I'm like, I don't want to put myself out there, I'm sure many of you feel the same way. At the same time, I still enjoy seeing other people's posts, so maybe I should post more. But the posts that get, sort of suggested to me on the algorithm tend to be posts of people traveling to Mykonos. I always wonder, some of these people, do they ever work? These people with these impossibly perfect bodies or these new clothes and different things. And it's that sense of when you see this culture, you get drawn into it. And maybe you want to sort of get on board. I mean, social media affects this boasting culture. People are boasting about all the different things that they've done and places they've gone. And one of the other things about this is it creates this mentality. This is one of the things that I don't like. It creates this mentality that the goal is not to spend your life sort of working hard in something you love and then retiring after a good, satisfying career, but to make the Hail Mary. There's that, I want to make it big. I want to be like all these great people and skip all the hard work steps in the way. Another problem with this boasting culture is that, some people like me, the arrogance of it, I just don't like it. And this is where this text that we have today that Frank read out from Luke, I find such an interesting one. Because here Jesus, he goes to this house of the Pharisees. So here are people who are doing pretty well. I mean, they're hosting, he's talking about hosting banquets. So these are not the down and out folks that he's hanging out with. Here are the folks who might live in Wellesley, where Jesus comes to. And he can identify right away that part of their problem is they're all focused on who has the position of the most honor. Who's got the position of the most honor at the table? Or who has the most likes on their posts on Instagram? And in response to that, he says, oh, yeah, it's great to be a place of honor, but you know what's horrible? You know what's the worst of all the worst? If you really like honor stuff, it's to be demoted in front of everyone else and publicly shamed. I see this text here about the shifting of seats almost as like Jesus making a joke of their obsession over where they sit. It's like, oh yeah, it's so important. Oh, it's such an important thing. But wouldn't it be awful if you had to like go down to the other end of the table? That would be really bad. And then he has this classic Jesus thing where he says, he moves it to like an eschatological framework where he's like, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, those who humble themselves will be exalted. A classic, the last will be first, the first will be last. One of Jesus' points that he says to the Pharisees and says to all of us is, whatever honor system might exist in this world, whatever boasting system might exist in this world, in God's kingdom, in the next world, the last will be first and the first will be last. Which is a hard thing for us to wrap our heads around. We spend our life trying to gain this success, trying to do as well as we can. And then when Jesus says, yeah, but in the next world, it doesn't work that way. The last will be first. And the first will be last. God's reality is different than the ways in which we puff ourselves up. Now, there's a secular version of this too. Here, Jesus is saying you shouldn't be boastful, you should humble yourself, not only because he's making fun of the honor culture there, but also because in God's framework it's different. But there's a secular framework that can also humble us when we realize actually how insignificant our lives are. It's so easy for us to magnify the things that we do and think of how important they are. But when we actually stop and think about it, they're actually not that important. This is one thing in my high school at Rochefort Latin, the headmaster always loved telling us, you're not that important. I mean, in the grand scheme of the universe, the 15 billion-year-old universe, we're in like the smallest speck of the smallest corner of this universe. When you think about how irrelevant we are on a sort of global scale, we're incredibly irrelevant. Our lives are massively short. But even within your life, it's amazing. This is humbling when you think about this. I remember when I taught at Eton College, I told this once before, but I was teaching at Eton College in England, fancy boarding school, all these really fancy kids. And these kids were, definitely did not have a low sense of self-confidence. And so one day I was teaching these seniors, and I was a little frustrated with these seniors, so I wanted to bring them down a peg. So I said to them, how many of you can name all of your great-grandparents? Their names. There are 8 of them. How many of you can name the names of your 8 great-grandparents? How many of you can tell me where they're buried so you can even go visit their graves? Maybe, if you're like most people, you can name half of them. These are people in your own family who might have died 20 years before you were born, and your own family forgets you. That is humbling. Whew. Turns out people don't really care how many likes you had on that post. Or even the famous people, they get forgotten. Just this morning I was thinking, I was like, who was Secretary of State in 1920? That's a big role. I mean, Secretary of State, if you're Secretary of State, you are the person, you are like one of the highest positions in the entire government. Who was Secretary of State in 1920? I had to look it up. Turns out there were 2 people, Robert Lansing and Bainbridge Colby. This is the end of the Wilson administration. Things weren't going so well for Wilson. Also, like another humbling thing is just the mere contingency of life, which is always worth reminding ourselves of. No matter how hard you work, no matter how many talents you have, a huge portion of your success is based on contingency. You meet the right person who gives you the right break. You have just the right thing that goes in just the right way, whatever it is. There's the right marketing thing, something clicks. And a certain degree of that is just outside your control, no matter how good you are. Contingency matters. And this is where Jesus pushes us even further, beyond saying, hey, listen, all your honor stuff shouldn't be as big as you think it is. But then he pushes them further and he says, and when you have a luncheon, invite all the outcasts, not the folks who are your friends. Again, I think we have to see this within the context of the text. I don't think Jesus is saying, don't go hang out with your friends and family. But that whole sense of, when you think about what matters in life, are you going based on God's last will be first, first will be last mentality? Are you making an effort to reach out to those who are wounded and outcast, inviting them in? Fundamentally, we puff ourselves up, we boast, because we're looking for meaning in life. We're looking for meaning in our successes. We want to be patted on the back by other people. And one of the things that Jesus is telling us is that when push comes to shove, at the end of the day, your meaning in life should be rooted in God, and you can find that deep meaning in caring for those who are outcasts. Not boasting about all the different stuff you've done, which most people forget, and is largely based on contingency, and certainly doesn't fit into God's scheme of where things should go. This was really brought home the other day. A friend sent me something, I'm sure like all people, you get sent certain clips online. This friend sent me this clip that really moved me. Maybe you've seen it. It was this guy named John Morello, a comedian, John Morello. And he talked about his life. He said he grew up in a broken family. He grew up in a broken family. He grew up in someone where one of his older brothers died in a drunk driving accident when he was in high school. Another brother was dropped out of high school after succumbing to addiction. He was skipping as many classes as he could in high school, was a total ne'er-do-well, going nowhere in life. And he said the person who changed his life was his Latin teacher. So my Latin teacher came in and said, Mr. Morello, you're really charismatic and funny, but you don't work at all. So here, I'll make you a deal. I'll give you a chance to tell jokes at the beginning of class if you actually do your Latin homework. And he's like, okay. So he gets up, he does his jokes, people love it. He's like, well, where's your Latin homework? Oh, it's here. And he said, over time, a funny thing happened. I look forward to Latin class every day. This was the first assignment I did, and then I started going to other classes. And then one day, this Latin teacher says, there's a part opening up in the school play. You should try out for it. So he did, and he got the role, and he got inspired to then go to college and major in drama. All because this teacher cared for him as an outcast, saw that as being meaning. And then he finishes his story by saying, a number of years later, he was with his wife, and they were at some movie theater or something. And he looks forward in line, and there's this Latin teacher. And the Latin teacher says hi to him, and John Morello's like, oh, you remember me? He's like, of course I remember you. And he turns to his wife and he said, oh, did he ever tell you the story of the stuffed animal? And Morello, as he tells the story, he's like, I didn't remember the story of the stuffed animal. And so the Latin teacher says to his wife, he says, well, one day in class, he said, I used to always have a stuffed animal on my desk, sort of a fun, quirky thing. And one day I came into class, and one of the students, before I got there, had taped to the stuffed animal, I am gay. And the Latin teacher said this was a time when being out and proud was not something that people did, especially in schools. It's back in the 80s. And he said he felt so much shame and he didn't know what to do. And then, of course, Mr. Morello comes in late, as he always did. And apparently he looked at the stuffed animal, looked at the note on it, took the note off, wrote underneath it, so what? And then put the note back on the stuffed animal, and then got up to do his comedy routine. And here's the Latin teacher said, you don't know how much that meant to me. These small actions of helping the outcasts, of inviting those people into the dinner table, of those connections, how meaningful they are in comparison to where you sit at the big, important banquet. It is important for all of us to remember the importance of being humble, the importance of what matters, because it's so easy to get caught up in those cycles that tell us that things matter that actually don't. And we as Christians need to think, what does Jesus really want of us? What does he really want us to do? Who does he want us to care for? What does it mean for us to be Christians, especially in this time of boasting?